Jake Mitchell had always lived by a simple philosophy: live and let live. His farm, a sprawling piece of land that had been in his family for generations, was more than just a livelihood. It was a legacy, a testament to the hard work and resilience of his ancestors. Waking up every morning to the sight of golden fields, the scent of fresh earth, and the sounds of his animals was all the peace he needed. That peace, however, was about to be shattered by a force far more persistent than any drought or storm: Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association in the neighboring suburban development that had cropped up about 5 years ago. A woman with an overinflated sense of authority, an obsession with rigid order, and an intolerance for anything that didn't fit her picture-perfect vision of what a community should look like, she had already made a name for herself enforcing rules no one remembered voting for. Her latest fixation, however, was Jake's farm, which sat just outside the HOA's official boundary. The sight of his barn, his animals, and even the mere existence of his unpaved driveway seemed to offend her sensibilities. The first time Karen appeared at Jake's property, she arrived with the energy of someone who had just been personally slighted. Dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit with a clipboard clutched to her chest, she marched up to his porch with the determination of a woman who had spent her entire life getting what she wanted through sheer force of will. Jake, who had been enjoying his morning coffee on the porch, watched her approach with mild amusement. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she began, her tone clipped and professional, like a salesperson about to launch into a pitch he didn't want to hear. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, leaning back in his chair. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to have a little chat about your property." Jake arched an eyebrow. "Didn't know I had anything to do with Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile was tight. "Well, technically you don't. But your farm is adjacent to our community, and as I'm sure you understand, property values are a very delicate matter." Jake set his mug down. And, Karen continued, "we've received multiple complaints about your operations. The noise, the smell, the visual impact on the neighborhood. We have a certain aesthetic we like to maintain, and we believe your farm would benefit from some adjustments." Jake let out a short laugh. "Adjustments? For starters, that large red barn is quite an eyesore. Perhaps you could repaint it to something more neutral? Or better yet, downsize? And then there's the matter of the rooster. Some of our residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Jake studied her for a moment, trying to determine whether she was serious. The barn had been standing for nearly 60 years, its red paint a staple of the farm's identity. As for the rooster, that was just nature doing what nature did. "So let me get this straight," he said finally, rubbing his chin. "You want me to change the color of my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's smile remained, but her eyes flashed with impatience. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake sighed, standing up and stretching. "Well, Ms. Whitmore, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of the HOA. I don't answer to your rules. And as far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said before turning sharply on her heel and marching back to her SUV. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but something told him Karen was going to be a whole different kind of problem. The trouble started almost immediately after that encounter. First came the letters, formal notices on HOA letterhead, demanding that he comply with neighborhood standards, despite the fact that his farm was outside their jurisdiction. Then came the complaints, calls to the county about supposed code violations, none of which held any legal weight. Jake dismissed them at first, but when Karen showed up again, flanked by 2 equally self-important HOA board members, he knew she wasn't going to let it go. "You again?" Jake said as he wiped his hands on a rag, stepping away from fixing the fence. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen greeted him with an exaggerated sigh, as if this was some exhausting formality rather than a battle she had willingly started. "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but you continue to ignore our requests." Jake crossed his arms. "That's because your requests are ridiculous." Karen ignored his response and handed him another document. "As per HOA regulations." "I'm not in your HOA," Jake interrupted, waving the paper back at her. "As per HOA regulations," she repeated, her voice tightening. All properties within visual range of Crestwood Estates must adhere to community aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here. Karen's expression didn't falter, but one of the board members, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, interjected. We have been in contact with county officials regarding zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of certain regulations, you may be subject to fines. Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in perfect compliance with agricultural zoning, but he also knew people like Karen were relentless. They'd dig and dig, looking for any excuse to make his life miserable. Well, you go ahead and do what you have to do, he said, stepping closer. But if you or anyone from your HOA so much as steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. Karen's expression finally cracked, a flicker of frustration crossing her face before she masked it again. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. No, Jake said, his voice steady. I think you are. With that, he turned his back on her and walked away, leaving her and her lackeys standing there. He could almost hear her teeth grinding as she huffed and stormed back to her car. That should have been the end of it. But as Jake would soon learn, Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She had declared war, and she wasn't backing down. The first sign that Karen was escalating things came in the form of an official-looking envelope, slipped into Jake's mailbox under the cover of darkness. He found it early the next morning while grabbing the mail, the HOA logo stamped smugly in the top left corner. He smirked. They really thought a few fancy words on letterhead were going to scare him? Inside, the letter outlined a list of violations his farm was allegedly committing, each more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved exterior color, red barn clashes with neighborhood aesthetics. Excessive noise pollution, rooster crowing before 8 a.m. Unauthorized livestock, goats, cows, and chickens are not allowed within community guidelines. The kicker? A demand that he cease and desist all non-compliant activities within 7 days or face legal action. Jake burst out laughing right there on his porch, nearly spilling his coffee. The audacity was impressive. He wasn't even part of the HOA. They had no legal grounds to dictate a single thing on his property. But the fact that they were willing to put this nonsense in writing meant one thing. Karen wasn't giving up. Instead of replying, Jake took the letter inside, tacked it onto his fridge like a trophy, and went about his day. But that was just the beginning. The next escalation came in the form of county inspectors. Apparently, someone, wonder who, had filed multiple complaints about health hazards on his farm. Over the next week, Jake received visits from the county health department, the zoning commission, and even animal welfare services. Each time, they arrived with serious expressions, clipboards in hand, only to leave utterly baffled when they found nothing wrong. The health department official, an older man named Roger, gave Jake a tired look as he scanned the perfectly maintained animal pens. Son, I don't know who you pissed off, but they've got us running circles. This is the cleanest farm I've inspected in months. Jake chuckled. Wouldn't happen to be a certain HOA president sending you, would it? Roger sighed. I can't say officially, but off the record? Yeah. Her name's on every complaint. They shook hands and Roger left, grumbling about entitled busybodies with too much time on their hands. But Karen wasn't done. Within days, handwritten complaints started appearing in his mailbox, and signed, of course, but written in the same aggressive, passive-aggressive style Karen was so fond of. Your farm's smell is making our property values plummet. Please be considerate of your neighbors. The sight of farm animals is distressing to young children. Consider fencing them off from public view. A well-kept lawn is a sign of respect. Mow the fields or expect further action. Jake was starting to get genuinely impressed by the sheer pettiness on display. Then things took a turn. One afternoon, while working on repairing a section of his old wooden fence, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw roaring to life. The noise wasn't coming from his property, but from the HOA side, near the boundary. Curious and suspicious, he set down his tools and walked over to investigate. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of HOA hired workers were putting up a fence on his land. Not just any fence, but a high, ugly, steel-gray structure designed to block off the view of his farm. They were cutting through a section of his property line to install it, acting as if they owned the land. And who was supervising with a smug look on her face? Karen, clipboard in hand, nodding approvingly. Jake strode up, voice like steel. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen turned. her expression the perfect blend of fake surprise and feigned politeness. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell. Just implementing some community improvements. This new privacy fence will help protect the visual harmony of Crestwood Estates." Jake gestured at the workers, who had the decency to at least look uncomfortable. "This fence is on my land." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Well, that's debatable. You see, the community has reviewed older survey maps, and we believe the original property lines were drawn incorrectly. Since your farm borders our neighborhood, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly." Jake's fingers curled into fists. They were literally trying to steal his land. "You believe the property lines were incorrect?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Yes," Karen said smoothly. "And until we receive further clarification, we're proceeding with this improvement project." Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward, locking eyes with the workers. "You boys got a permit for this?" One of them hesitated before muttering, HOA told us they had all the legal permissions." Jake smirked. "They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing. Which means I'll be calling the sheriff, and you'll be the ones in legal trouble." That did it. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They started gathering their equipment, clearly not willing to go to jail for an overzealous HOA. Karen, however, was livid. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. "This is a community decision." Jake pulled out his phone and, in full view of everyone, started dialing the sheriff's number. "Then let's make it official and have the county sort it out." Karen paled. "There's no need for that," she said stiffly. "Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up," Jake said, voice dripping with amusement. With a murderous glare, Karen signaled for the workers to leave. The fence project was dead before it had even begun. Jake didn't stop there. That night, he dug through his property deed, found the official surveyor's map, and made copies. The next morning, he sent it, along with a formal cease and desist letter, directly to the HOA board, making it clear that if anyone from the HOA so much as set foot on his land again, he would press trespassing charges. For a few days, it seemed like Karen had finally backed off. Then the HOA's next move came. A week later, Jake woke up to find a massive for sale sign planted on his property. It was positioned near the road, looking as if his farm was suddenly on the market. Beneath it, a second sign read, "Under negotiation, coming soon to Crestwood Estates." Jake almost admired the audacity. Furious, he stormed over to the sign, ripped it out of the ground, and stomped back to his porch. Before he could even call the HOA office, Karen herself showed up, feigning innocence. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she chirped, as if they were old friends. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure." Jake folded his arms. "Do tell." "Well," she continued, eyes gleaming, "we at the HOA have been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some realtors assumed your farm was included in the new Crestwood development, and the sign was placed prematurely." Jake stared at her. "You're telling me a real estate agency just mistakenly put a for sale sign on my land, completely by accident?" Karen's smile faltered slightly. "Well, perhaps there was some enthusiasm about the prospect." Jake cut her off. "You're insane if you think you can just claim my land and hope I won't notice." Karen sighed dramatically, as if he were being unreasonable. "We just want to make the community a better place." Jake took a slow step forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put this sign up and tell them to never set foot on my property again. Because if I see another one, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing the entire HOA for fraud." Karen paled. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, let's not be hasty." Jake pulled out his phone. "I can also get the county involved if you'd like." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. With an angry huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't done. He knew it, but neither was he. Karen was relentless. If she couldn't force Jake to comply through legal intimidation, complaints, or blatant land theft, she'd find other ways to make his life miserable. But what she hadn't counted on was that Jake wasn't the kind of man to roll over and take it. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure Karen regretted every step she took against him. The first thing he did was get ahead of her tactics. He went to the county records office and pulled every single document related to his farm, deeds, zoning approvals, land use permits, everything. He made copies and kept them on hand, ready to shove legal proof into Karen's face the next time she tried anything underhanded. Then Jake went on the offensive. He called up Sheriff Tom Caldwell, an old family friend, and filled him in on the whole situation. Tom already knew about the bogus complaints, but hadn't realized how far Karen was pushing things. "You're telling me she tried putting up a fence on your land? And then slapped a for sale sign on it?" the sheriff said, incredulous. "Yup," Jake replied. "And I have proof." Tom sighed. "All right, you let me know if she steps a toe out of line again. The next time she or her people trespass, I'll make sure they get the message loud and clear." With that backup secured, Jake turned his attention to making Karen's life as miserable as she was making his. First came the petty revenge. Karen had complained about his rooster? Fine. Jake decided to add more. He bought 3 new roosters and set up a perfectly legal but obnoxiously loud morning routine. Every morning at 5 a.m. sharp, the chorus of crowing would start, carrying all the way into Crestwood Estates. Then he planted sunflowers. Karen had once complained that his fields were an eyesore compared to the manicured lawns of the HOA. So Jake went all in. He planted an entire field of bright yellow sunflowers directly along the property line. Now, instead of looking at ugly farmland, the HOA had to deal with a towering wall of flowers blocking their pristine view. But the real fun came when he got the town involved. Jake had a friend, Mason, who ran the local farmers market. Together, they came up with an idea. Why not host a weekly farm event on Jake's land? It would be perfectly legal, and best of all, it would be loud. That next weekend, Jake put up flyers. Farmers Fun Day, free entry. Come meet the animals, enjoy fresh produce, and support local farmers. The turnout was bigger than expected. Dozens of families showed up, kids running around petting goats, adults buying fresh eggs and milk, and a few local musicians even volunteered to play live country music. It was an absolute nightmare for Karen. As expected, she came storming up to the event, livid. "This is completely unacceptable," she screeched, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "You can't just turn your farm into a public spectacle." Jake, grinning, crossed his arms. "Oh, but I can. See, I checked the county laws, and my property is fully zoned for agritourism." Karen's eye twitched. But the noise. The parking. All legal. County approved. And people love it," Jake said, gesturing to the happy families around him. "In fact, I might make it a weekly thing. Maybe even expand it to a full farmer's market." Karen opened and closed her mouth, looking as if she might actually explode. With nothing left to argue, she stomped away, muttering about bringing this up with the board. But Karen wasn't done. And neither was Jake. The next escalation was dirty. A few days later, Jake started noticing strange cars parked near the road at odd hours. At first, he thought it was just nosy HOA members. But then he saw a drone flying over his property. Karen had actually hired a private investigator. Jake caught the guy snooping around, taking pictures from just outside the fence line. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake called out. The man, caught red-handed, tried to play it cool. "Just, checking on a local property dispute." Jake snorted. "Yeah. Well, you can check from a distance. This is private property." Later that evening, Jake got another HOA letter. A new list of violations, this time including unsanitary animal conditions and possible zoning infractions. Jake had had enough. He called his lawyer, got a full cease and desist order drafted, and marched straight to the HOA board meeting. Karen, of course, was in her element, standing at the front, lecturing the other members on upholding community standards, when Jake walked in uninvited. Gasps filled the room. Jake didn't live in the HOA, so he had no reason to be there. But he didn't care. He walked straight to the front, dropped the stack of legal papers onto the table, and crossed his arms. "You've been harassing me, trespassing on my land, filing false complaints, and now you're sending people to spy on me?" Jake said, his voice echoing through the room. Karen turned red. That's a ridiculous accusation." Jake smirked. "Really? Because I have security footage of your investigator snooping around. And this," he pointed at the documents, "is an official legal notice. If you don't stop immediately, I'll be suing not just the HOA, but you personally for harassment, defamation, and illegal surveillance." The room went dead silent. A few HOA members shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, not everyone was on board with Karen's crusade. One older woman coughed. "Karen, maybe we should just let this go. He's not actually part of the HOA." Karen's face was practically purple with rage. "He's disrupting the community." "Or," Jake interrupted, "you're just a control freak who doesn't know when to quit." Karen looked like she wanted to scream, But before she could say anything else, the HOA president, an older, quiet man named Richard, finally spoke up. "I think Mr. Mitchell is right," Richard said, flipping through the papers Jake had provided. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over his farm. And if he's prepared to take legal action, we should reconsider our approach." Karen gaped at him. "You can't be serious." Richard sighed. "Karen, you've done good work here, but I think you're taking this too far." That was the beginning of the end for Karen. Over the next week, half the HOA board turned against her. Some members, fearing legal trouble, resigned. Others publicly apologized to Jake for the harassment. And then came the final blow. The HOA president called for an emergency vote. Karen was officially removed from her position. Jake didn't even need to do anything. The neighborhood was sick of her antics, and once she lost her power, the HOA quickly fell apart. 1 week later, Karen's house went up for sale. The rumor was that she'd been quietly pressured to leave by the very people she once ruled over. Jake couldn't have asked for a better ending. A few months later, he expanded his farm business, turned his weekend farmers market into a thriving event, and never heard from the HOA again. And just for good measure, he put up a brand new sign at the edge of his property. "Welcome to Mitchell Farms. HOA free since 1923. It became a town landmark. Karen may have started the war. But Jake finished it. Word of the battle between Jake and Karen spread like wildfire, and soon, the whole town knew about the war between the stubborn farmer and the overzealous HOA dictator. What had started as a personal feud was now a full-blown community drama, with Crestwood Estates caught in the middle. But the reactions of the neighborhood weren't as straightforward as Karen had hoped. At first, some of the HOA members rallied behind Karen. They were the kind of people who loved rules for the sake of rules. Folks who measured their grass with a ruler, reported kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk, and lived for the smug satisfaction of a well-placed complaint letter. They fully bought into Karen's nonsense about Jake's farm being an eyesore that ruined their suburban paradise. These people believed that their property values were more important than a man's right to his own land, and that Jake should do the right thing by selling and letting the HOA expand. But then there were the neutral homeowners. People who just wanted to grill in their backyards without getting an HOA fine for unauthorized smoke. They had no real problem with Jake and didn't care that a farm sat on the outskirts of their development. To them, it had always been there, and his land was his business. These people watched the situation unfold like it was the town's newest reality TV show, complete with Karen's outbursts, Jake's petty revenge tactics, and the sheer absurdity of it all. They had no stake in the fight, but they sure as hell enjoyed the drama. Then came Jake's unexpected allies, the HOA rebels. These were the people who had been living under Karen's iron rule for years, quietly fuming but too afraid to push back. They had been fined for ridiculous infractions. Mailboxes too high, Christmas lights left up a day too long, even children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Karen had made their lives hell, and they saw Jake's fight as a beacon of hope. One of the first to reach out was Linda Matthews, a middle-aged woman who had lived in Crestwood Estates since it was built. She had been on the HOA board once, years ago, before Karen forced her out. One afternoon, she strolled onto Jake's farm with a fresh-baked apple pie and a knowing smirk. "You don't know it yet, Jake, but you're doing God's work," she said, handing him the pie. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't figure HOA folks for the pie-gifting type." Linda snorted. "Oh, please. Not all of us are lunatics. You think I like getting fined because my grandkids drew a hopscotch board on my driveway?" She shook her head. "I want Karen gone. And I'm not the only one." Linda wasn't bluffing. Over the next few days, more and more residents started coming forward, quietly supporting Jake. They couldn't openly defy the HOA yet. Karen still had power, but they started leaking inside information. That's how Jake found out Karen had been faking complaints. One of the HOA rebels, Greg, an older veteran, showed up one evening with a manila folder and a devilish grin. "You're gonna love this," he said, sliding the folder across Jake's porch table. Inside were copies of internal HOA emails. "Karen's been sending in fake complaints under different names," Greg explained. She knew the county would ignore her if all the reports came from the HOA itself, so she started using fake resident names to pad the numbers. Jake let out a low whistle. "That's bold." "Oh, it gets better," Greg said. She also tried to get the board to approve a special assessment, a one-time fee every homeowner would have to pay. She wanted to use HOA funds to legally fight you. Jake laughed. She really thought she could make people pay for her personal vendetta? She tried, Greg smirked. Didn't go over well. Indeed, the tides were turning. Some of the more level-headed HOA members were growing tired of Karen's obsession. They started questioning why they were wasting time and resources harassing a farmer who wasn't even part of their community. Then there were the town outsiders, the people who didn't live in Crestwood Estates but had a strong opinion anyway. Small-town gossip was a force of nature, and soon, Jake's battle with the HOA became the town's favorite source of entertainment. A local Facebook group blew up with posts about it. I don't even live in Crestwood, but I hope the farmer wins. HOA people are the worst. The fact that Karen thought she could annex a farm into her HOA is absolutely insane. I want a reality TV show about this. I'd watch the hell out of it. Even the local diner got in on it. A waitress at Maggie's Cafe started naming menu items after the feud. The Karen Special, a plain, dry chicken sandwich with a side of unsalted fries. The Jake Burger, a hearty, fully loaded cheeseburger with extra bacon. It got so bad that even the local newspaper ran a story about it, interviewing people from the neighborhood. One of Jake's personal favorites was a quote from an anonymous HOA member. "Look, I don't love the farm being there, but if I have to choose between hearing a rooster in the morning or another 2 years of Karen running the HOA, I'll take the damn rooster." Of course, Karen was furious about all of this. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. The HOA members who once feared her were starting to ignore her rules. But Karen wasn't about to go down quietly. That's when she tried to pull the ultimate power move. One morning, Jake woke up to find that every single road leading to his farm had been lined with "No trespassing" private community signs. The HOA had actually tried to claim the public road as private property. Jake stared at the signs, shaking his head. She was getting desperate. Not one to let things slide, Jake made a few phone calls. Within hours, a county official arrived, furious. Turns out, the HOA had no legal right to block the road. Not only that, but the county official was already annoyed with Karen due to the constant complaints she'd been filing. By the end of the day, not only were the signs removed, but Karen received a warning from the county for attempting to interfere with public roads. That was strike 3. By now, the HOA was fed up. The board held an emergency meeting, and for the first time, Karen was outnumbered. Jake got a text from Linda that night. "It's happening. They're voting to remove her as president." Jake grinned. A few hours later, Linda sent another text. "She's out. It's over." Karen had finally lost her grip on the HOA. The next morning, her house was up for sale. Rumor had it that she had been quietly pressured to leave by the very people she once controlled. No one wanted her around anymore. Jake didn't even need to go to the HOA meeting to celebrate. Instead, he just sat on his porch, sipped his coffee, and enjoyed the sound of his roosters crowing. Peace had finally returned. Karen's downfall wasn't just a singular moment. It was a glorious, drawn-out collapse that exposed her for the power-hungry fraud she was. She had spent years controlling the HOA with an iron fist. But the problem with ruling through fear was that the second people stopped fearing you, they turned against you. And once her downfall began, it was like watching a dam burst. It all started with the emergency HOA meeting. The same board members who had once cowered in her presence were now openly questioning her leadership. Richard, the HOA president, had never been a fan of Karen's antics, but as long as things ran smoothly, he tolerated her. But this whole war with Jake? It had gone too far. That night, Crestwood's community center was packed. Homeowners who never attended meetings showed up, eager to see what was going to happen. Jake didn't bother attending. He didn't need to. The people who once supported Karen were now calling for her resignation. "Let's get straight to the point," Richard said, standing at the front of the room. "We have received multiple formal complaints about misuse of HOA resources, unauthorized actions, and possible legal liabilities, all stemming from Karen's personal vendetta against a property that isn't even part of the HOA." Karen, sitting at the head of the table like she still owned the place, scoffed. "That's a ridiculous accusation. I've only been doing what's best for this community." Greg, the veteran who had passed Jake the HOA emails, stood up from his seat. "Bull, you've been using our money and our rules to bully a man who has nothing to do with us. And you tried to charge us all a special assessment to cover your legal nonsense. We're done." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Linda, who had been waiting for this moment, added, "And let's not forget the fake complaints, or the illegal attempt to fence off his land, or the time you had a PI spying on him." Karen's face turned red. I don't have to sit here and listen to baseless accusations. Oh, they're not baseless, Richard interrupted, holding up a thick folder of documented evidence. Jake Mitchell sent us a legal cease and desist order. The county's already warned us about overstepping our authority. And if we don't act tonight, this HOA is going to get sued hard. That was the final straw. The board voted on the spot. Karen was officially removed as HOA enforcer. She tried to fight it, tried to argue, plead, and even threaten legal action. But the board was done with her. Without their backing, she had no power. The final humiliation came when Richard handed her an official notice. As of tonight, you are no longer authorized to represent this HOA in any capacity, he said firmly. And Karen, I'd strongly suggest that you list your house for sale, because after everything you've done, nobody here wants you around anymore. Karen sat there, her hands trembling with rage. She had lost. And for a woman like her, there was nothing worse than losing. The very next morning, a moving truck showed up in front of Karen's house. Rumor had it that she wasn't just leaving the neighborhood, she was leaving town altogether. But Jake wasn't done delivering justice. That same afternoon, he had a new sign custom made and placed it right along the edge of his property, facing Crestwood Estates. It read in bold, black letters, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms. No HOA, no Karens, no problem." It became a local landmark. People from all over town came by to take pictures next to it. 1 week later, Karen's house was officially listed for sale. 2 weeks later, she was gone. And just like that, the reign of HOA Karen was over. With Karen gone, peace finally returned to Crestwood Estates and to Jake's farm. The difference was immediate and almost comical. People who had once lived in fear of HOA fines suddenly started relaxing. Yards that had been meticulously micromanaged by Karen's absurd rules were now filled with personality. Kids could finally ride their bikes without being reported, and families weren't scared of receiving passive-aggressive warning letters for leaving their trash cans out an hour too long. For Jake, life got even better. The HOA board, now under new leadership, sent him a formal apology letter, one that he framed and hung up right next to Karen's infamous cease and desist letter. It was poetic, but the best part, they actually offered to make peace. One evening, Linda and a few of the former HOA rebels showed up at Jake's farm with a basket of fresh-baked goods. "We figured we owed you a proper apology," Linda said, handing him a homemade pecan pie. Jake smirked, leaning against the porch railing. "What's this? An HOA trying to make amends? Never thought I'd see the day." Linda chuckled. "Let's just say, without Karen breathing down our necks, things are a little different." One of the others, a quiet man named Ted, scratched his head. "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We didn't want to end up on Karen's hit list." "Understandable," Jake said, taking a bite of pie. "She had a way of making life hell." Linda nodded. "But now that she's gone, we were thinking, maybe a fresh start? No more fighting." Jake considered it for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "as long as no one starts trying to annex my land again, I think we can call a truce." Everyone laughed, and just like that, years of hostility started fading away. But karma? Karma wasn't done with Karen. A few weeks later, news circulated through town that Karen's attempt to start fresh in a new neighborhood had gone spectacularly wrong. Apparently, she had moved into another HOA-run community in a different town, thinking she could climb her way back into power. But what she hadn't realized was that this HOA already had an enforcer, a woman just as strict and power-hungry as she had been. Within a month, Karen found herself on the receiving end of the very same HOA nonsense she had inflicted on others. She was reported for her grass being half an inch too high. She got fined for parking too close to the curb. And the best part? Her new HOA president hated troublemakers. The second Karen tried to assert herself, demanding a leadership role, she was shut down so fast it made her head spin. By the time Jake heard about it, Karen had already put her new house up for sale, again. Poetic justice at its finest. Meanwhile, Jake's farm thrived. Without HOA interference, he expanded his weekend market, and it became one of the town's biggest attractions. Families came from all over to enjoy fresh produce, live music, and good food. Even some of the HOA members became regular visitors, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Karen had tried to destroy. Jake never saw Karen again. But every now and then, when he sat on his porch drinking coffee, he'd glance at the sign by his property line, the one reminding the world that Mitchell Farms was a Karen-free zone. And he'd smile, because in the end, Karma had done exactly what it was supposed to.